Imagine you haven't eaten in 2 days. You know exactly where the herd is. You tracked it yesterday. You found the prints. You mapped the route in your mind. And now all you have to do is get there. Then it starts raining. Not a light drizzle, a heavy, soaking, wind-driven rain that refuses to stop. It lasts all day, then all night, then the next morning, and it's still falling. Now you can't hunt. You can't see tracks because the mud has washed them away. You can't move across open ground because wet terrain and bare feet on rocky ground can mean a twisted ankle, and a twisted ankle out here means death. The river near your camp is rising, and the fire, the one thing keeping you warm, keeping predators away, and keeping you alive, is beginning to struggle. You're not bored, you're trapped. For most of human history, rain wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. And what ancient humans did during that crisis may have been more important than anything they did under a clear sky. Today, when it rains, you close the window, make yourself a coffee, maybe grab a blanket and open Netflix. You settle onto the couch, shift around until you find the perfect spot, and slowly relax. For you, rain is simply background noise. It makes you feel calm. It makes you feel sleepy. You might not even finish the episode. But for a human living 50,000 years ago, that very same rain, the exact sound you're falling asleep to, could kill you in 3 different ways before it even ended. The first was the cold. A wet human loses body heat up to 25 times faster than a dry one. Without clothing, without waterproof shelter, a long rainstorm in temperatures below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit could lower your core body temperature into hypothermia within just a few hours. And most of the regions our ancestors lived in became that cold at night, even parts of Africa during the wet season at higher elevations. The second was flooding. Caves and rock shelters, the main places humans lived, were often located at the base of hillsides or close to rivers, so heavy rain meant flash floods. Archaeologists have discovered layers of flood sediment inside occupied caves, showing that water entered while people were still living there. Some of those layers are remarkably thick, and after those floods, some of those caves were never occupied again. The third was predators, and perhaps it was the worst. Rain drove animals toward shelter too, and sometimes that shelter was the very same cave you were hiding in. There are cave sites in South Africa where human remains and the remains of large cats have been found in the very same layers. Some of those human skulls contain puncture marks that match leopard teeth almost perfectly. So rain didn't just make life uncomfortable, it compressed the entire world. Humans, predators, prey, all of them forced into the same small dry shelters at the same time. And in the middle of all that, one task mattered more than anything else: keeping the fire alive. And here's why that was so frightening. Before roughly 40,000 years ago, we're not entirely sure how reliably humans could create fire from scratch. There's evidence of controlled fire use going back at least 400,000 years at a site called Kesem Cave in Israel, and possibly as far back as 1,000,000 years at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. But here's the important part. Keeping an existing fire alive and starting one from nothing are 2 completely different skills. And for most of human history, most people probably couldn't do the second. So if your fire went out, you might not be able to light it again. You'd have to carry an ember from somewhere else, which some groups actually did. They carried smoldering coals wrapped in green leaves or packed inside a type of woody mushroom called tinder fungus, which could catch a spark and slowly smolder for hours. It was essentially a biological lighter. And we know this wasn't simply guesswork. When archaeologists discovered Ötzi, the Iceman, the 5,300-year-old frozen man preserved in the Alps, he was carrying a complete fire-making kit inside his belt pouch: tinder fungus, flint, iron pyrite for striking sparks, and extra plant tinder as a backup. Even 5,000 years ago, losing your fire was serious enough that people carried dedicated equipment to make sure it didn't happen. So when the rain arrived, the first priority wasn't shelter. It was the fire. Move it deeper into the cave, protect it with hides or brush, feed it carefully, not too much, not too little. Look for dead lower branches from conifer trees, the ones still protected beneath the canopy and usually dry underneath. Split open wet logs to reach the dry wood hidden inside. Use birch bark as kindling because birch contains a chemical called betulin that can still burn even when it's wet. One person's entire responsibility during a rainstorm might be simply sitting beside that fire for hours, feeding it, shielding it, making sure it stayed alive. Because that fire was everything. It was warmth, light, protection, cooked food, and the center of every social interaction the group shared. Letting it die wasn't just careless, it could be fatal for everyone. Alright, so the fire is still burning and you're mostly dry, but you still can't leave, so what do? You make things. The archaeological record is remarkably clear. Caves and rock shelters are filled with evidence of manufacturing. Stone tools in every stage of production, piles of flaking debris, the tiny chips of rock that fly off while shaping a tool, found concentrated in particular spots inside caves, exactly where someone would have sat beside the fire, working for hours. But it wasn't only stone tools. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists uncovered a 100,000-year-old ochre processing workshop, abalone shells used as mixing bowls, ochre ground into fine powder, bone tools used to stir and apply it. This wasn't simple survival, this was organized production. Someone sat in that cave, probably while the rain poured outside, carefully producing pigment with a deliberate system. Then there are the bone needles. They begin appearing in the archaeological record around 61,000 years ago in South Africa and later throughout Europe and Asia. These are delicate, finely crafted tools with tiny drilled eyes. You don't make a bone needle while running from danger. You make one while sitting still, focused, with hours of free time. Rainy days gave people exactly that opportunity. Now, here's where things become really interesting. At Abri-du-Maris in France, archaeologists discovered a tiny fragment of twisted plant fiber string dating back roughly 52,000 years. That's the oldest direct evidence of string ever found. Then at Hohlefels Cave in Germany, they uncovered a 35,000-year-old tool carved from mammoth ivory with 4 holes and spiral grooves, designed specifically for twisting plant fibers into rope. Someone sat inside that cave and carved a dedicated rope-making tool. Making rope is slow, repetitive, and requires patience. It's the perfect task for bad weather. And rope changed everything. It allowed you to tie objects together, build stronger shelters, create snares and traps, and fasten tools to wooden handles. An enormous amount of human technology depends on string, and string was almost certainly invented by someone stuck indoors waiting for the rain to end. But it wasn't only tools and rope. People were also improving the places they lived. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found something most people would never expect from 77,000 years ago. Bedding, real bedding, layers of sedges, rushes, and grasses, carefully arranged into sleeping mats. The upper layers even contained leaves from a plant called Cape Laurel, a natural insect repellent. Someone wasn't simply surviving in that cave. They were making it comfortable. They were making it feel like home. And those bedding layers were regularly burned and replaced to keep them clean. 77,000 years ago, people were already practicing pest control. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because everything we've talked about so far, the tools, the rope, the bedding, that's the practical side. What came next was something completely different. Art. Chauvet Cave in southern France contains paintings that are roughly 36,000 years old. Lions, horses, rhinos, bears, drawn with a level of skill and observation that still amazes people today. The artists understood anatomy, movement, perspective. Some of the animals are shown mid-stride, muscles tense, heads turning. They're the work of people who spent thousands of hours watching these animals from memory, deep underground by firelight. And Chauvet isn't the only example. Lascaux, Altamira, Sulawesi in Indonesia, where cave art dates back at least 45,000 years, making it the oldest known figurative art in the world. But here's what makes this especially fascinating. These paintings aren't near the cave entrance where people sheltered. They're deep inside, sometimes hundreds of meters in.
beyond narrow passages, inside chambers that require crawling to reach. Someone carried animal fat lamps into complete darkness and painted. Think about that for a moment. Nobody does that when the weather is perfect and the hunt is going well. You do it when you can't go outside, when it's been raining for 2 straight days, when you've already sharpened every tool you own, when there's nothing left to do except venture deeper into the darkness and create something. Now, we can't prove that cave art was specifically a rainy day activity, but the logic fits remarkably well. The greatest creative explosion in human prehistory happened in the very places where people were most likely to spend long periods trapped indoors. And that leads to something even bigger. Rain didn't just inspire art, it may have created culture itself. Think about it. What happens when 15 to 30 people are forced to share a confined space for days with very little to do? You talk, you listen, you exchange knowledge. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Weissner published a study comparing daytime conversations with nighttime fireside conversations among the Juhanzi Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. During the day, people mostly discussed practical topics, land rights, resources, complaints. But at night, gathered around the fire, more than 80% of the conversation shifted towards stories, songs, and ceremonies. The firelight changed what people talked about. It softened faces, reduced tension, created an environment where people opened up. The campfire wasn't just a source of warmth, it was humanity's first social network. And what people shared around that fire wasn't meaningless conversation. It was survival, where the water sources disappear during the summer, which plants are safe to eat, where to find the best flint, how to track a particular animal. That wasn't gossip. It was essential knowledge passing from one mind to another through speech. And beyond all the practical knowledge, there was something else. Stories, myths, explanations for why the rain comes and where it goes. Every ancient culture on Earth has myths about rain, and someone had to invent those stories. They were almost certainly created while people were sitting through the very situation those stories were trying to explain. And here's something that reveals just how powerful storytelling really was.
The oldest known oral traditions verified against real geological events are Australian Aboriginal stories describing sea level changes that occurred roughly 7,000 years ago. Those stories survived for 7,000 years through nothing but people telling them to one another. That kind of cultural memory doesn't develop unless groups spend enormous amounts of time doing exactly that, sitting together, retelling the same stories again and again. So rainy days weren't wasted time, they were transmission time. The days when knowledge passed from the old to the young, when skills were taught through demonstration, when the group's shared memory was reinforced and expanded. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about. Rain wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it was actually the best thing that could happen. After a heavy rain, the ground becomes soft, and soft ground creates perfect tracks, deep, clear, detailed. You can tell exactly which animals passed by, how long ago, how fast they were moving, and where they were headed. Some of the best tracking conditions in the world appear right after the rain stops. Rain also meant water. Humans could collect and store rainwater, and even early hominins may have understood that. Rock depressions that fill with clean rainwater are found near almost every known prehistoric campsite. Some even show signs of being intentionally carved deeper to hold more water. But water wasn't the only thing rain brought. Mushrooms and many plants appear in abundance after rainfall. Tubers become easier to dig from softened soil. Insects emerge to the surface. A rainy period didn't stop the food supply, it transformed it. And the groups that understood those changes gained a huge advantage over those that didn't. Termites are a perfect example. They swarm after rain across tropical Africa. They're among the most protein-rich foods available. You don't need tools, you don't need weapons, you simply gather them. Even today, chimpanzees gorge themselves on termite swarms after heavy rain. Early humans almost certainly did the same, probably on an even larger scale. So what did ancient humans do when it rained all day? Everything that mattered. They kept the fire alive. They crafted the tools they'd use on the next hunt. They sewed the clothing that would keep them warm through winter. They twisted the rope that held their shelters together. They prepared the pigments they'd later use to paint animals deep inside cave walls. They shared the stories that carried survival knowledge across generations. And when the rain finally stopped, they stepped outside onto soft ground covered with fresh animal tracks and returned to work.
Rain didn't slow them down, it gave them time to prepare for everything that came next. Every tool, every piece of clothing, every story, every painting on a cave wall, all of it came from downtime, from the hours and days when people couldn't go outside and had nothing to do except sit beside a fire and create. Boredom didn't exist for them the way it exists for us, because when you're sitting in a cave while rain pounds outside and your survival depends on what you make with your hands over the next few hours, you don't get bored. You become creative. And that may be one of the biggest reasons we're still here.